Sweden in the early 1990s was in a very similar situation to us now. Basically, they had a big credit bubble and housing bubble that burst. As a result, there was a big financial crisis in Sweden and the economy fell into a steep recession. The banking system was going through massive losses and 2 out of the large 6 banks had to be nationalized. The economy was suffering as well. Industrial production fell by 17% and house prices just crashed. So when you just look at the similarities between that situation and what we are going through today, you understand that a lot of policymakers and central bankers look at the Swedish example to understand how to manage such a crisis. Now, the one interesting thing that's often overlooked is that even in Sweden, there was one very large bank that was just doing fine, was actually having quite a good crisis. They just kept lending to their customers. They never had any massive losses. They were gaining market share from all the other banks that were crashing and going bankrupt left and right next to them. And this bank actually came out of this crisis with a much better and bigger position. 3 years later, their profits were 50% higher than in the record year before the crisis. This bank was called Svenska Handelsbanken, and its current performance in this financial crisis is fairly similar to what happened in the early 1990s. So I think there are 2 things that are important about this whole example. One is that the macro picture that you look at is only part of the story. When you look at Sweden, for instance, at the macro level, you would say huge banking losses in the banking system overall. But that's just an average, and that average masks very big differences. In that average, you find those banks that went bankrupt and other banks, like Handelsbanken, that were just doing fine and actually benefiting. And the obvious question is, of course, can't we just have more banks like the latter? So that is, banks that are fairly resilient in a crisis, that keep lending to their customers and are just doing fine. So I think it's an important question to look at individual banks if we really want to understand how to run banks in a better and safer way after the credit crunch. Now, the second point is, let's say in 1989, if you had looked at the Swedish banks overall, I think just looking at what they're doing, you wouldn't have spotted a big difference between Handelsbanken and the rest of them. After all, these were all large Swedish banks. They were more or less dealing with the same groups of customers. Handelsbanken was a big lender in the mortgage space as well. So it wouldn't really have told you anything that about why Handelsbanken was doing so differently. So in a way, you have to look quite carefully at the details, the operating practice of the banks, how they manage their operations. So in a way, you have to look at how they do things and not just at what they do to really understand what the crucial differences are.